This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the 1960s American rock band, the Nazz. I have two rock journalists and historians, and we will commence our conversation in a moment. The Nazz was an American band in the late 1960s. Its most famous member was Todd Rundgren, and I believe that it's a great band that just things didn't go right for them. And I have two rock journalists that will be speaking on that about the Nazz themselves. Bill Kopp is up in the left corner. As I usually do, I want to give my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves. So, Bill, if you could tell a little bit about who you are, what you do, and opening opinions about the Nazz.
Okay, I'm an author, speaker, and music journalist. I've been doing it for about 20 years or so. I think I've interviewed somewhere around between 1,000 and 1,100 artists in pretty much every genre, and I've written a couple books. My first one was Reinventing Pink Floyd from Syd Barrett to the Dark Side of the Moon, and the second one was Disturbing the Peace, which is the story of 415 Records, a San Francisco-based label from the 1980s. I've been a lifelong Todd Rundgren fan, and have had the pleasure of seeing him in concert many times, meeting him a few times, and interviewing him, I believe, 7 times, the most recent of which serendipitously happened to be just a couple weeks ago, and we actually spoke about Nazz.
I happen to be a Barrett man rather than a Gilmore man, just to get that on the record. But my other, let me say, musoscribe.com is your website. I will be linking to that and also to Matt's Pop Goes the 60s YouTube channel below this video for anyone interested in what they do themselves. Matt Williamson is at the bottom of the screen. So Matt, if you could give a little bit of background about yourself, talk about your YouTube channel and your opening volleys on the Nazz.
Well, my YouTube channel is called Pop Goes the 60s, and it's basically a historical channel on 60s bands, focusing on individual band histories, of which the Nazz was one of the histories I've done. And there's a big Beatle component as well. So, and I go outside of music, but it's everything 60s and with a focus on the music. The Nazz has been a band that I've always been a fan of, and I remember learning about them in the 80s and realizing, oh, Todd Rundgren was in this band. So that's how that was my entry point to the Nazz. And obviously Rundgren's always been in the background of the soundtrack of my youth in the 70s growing up. So his music is a big part of, my childhood and just forming my musical tastes. And following his career, he's just been an innovator, and he's always doing something new. So it's always interesting to see what he's got going on. And I've seen him in several interviews lately. So I'm not surprised that Bill has done something recently with him. So he's always got something interesting to say.
So let me just give a little background as to why I wanted to do this show. And I need to, if I had the special effects going, we do a little wavy flashback thing here about 5 years ago. And I'm going to start with Lucille Ball, because when I was a kid, there was a show called The Lucy Show, and there was a young blonde girl named Candy Moore who was on that show. And about 5 years ago, going through these little netlets things, where they do the repeats of all these old shows, I saw The Lucy Show, and I was like, holy crap, I forgot about the girl. I was born in 65, so she was about 15, 20 years older than me, but I remember having a crush on her, watching her in repeats, and I totally forgotten about it. And in the 1970s, I had crushes on Valerie Bertinelli and Charlie's Angels and all this, but I forgot about my first pop crush. 50 years it took me to remember, shit, Candy Moore. She, of course, became a little bit more famous because she was the model that Varga did the sketch drawing for the Cars Candy O. And supposedly Candy O was just, a coincidence that it was Candy Moore doing Candy O. Fast forward to October of last year or so, and I'm listening to a YouTube playlist of 60s type songs, and I hear "Open My Eyes," and I'm like, fuck, I know that song. I remember that song when I was 3 or 4 years old, and it was played all the time in the New York. I think it was WPLJ, the playlist or whatnot. I'm like, who the fuck was in that band? So I look it up, and I'm like, Todd Rundgren was in that band. And I was like, I knew Todd Rundgren from his solo career. I knew him from Utopia. I knew him, he went through, like you said, so diverse that there are some videos of him where he looks like a monstrous mix of Elton John and Parliament Funkadelic or something. And I was like, shit, this is good. So I listened to I looked up stuff. I found Matt's stuff. I saw Bill's writing. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, this was a fucking good band. And I was like, how the hell did they not make it bigger? And so, I read the stories, and we'll talk about that. So let me throw that back to you. Let me start with you, Bill. Let's talk about the beginnings of the band. How did they form? They were from Philadelphia, which is, in my mind, I always associate Philadelphia with sort of that 1950s doo-wop kind of sound. But how did the band actually form?
Well, just to pick up on something that you referenced, that whole Philly soul thing, it's not really a component of what Nazz was doing very much, but it definitely made quite an impression on Todd Rundgren. The Philly soul vibe is something that runs through a lot of his solo work. Lots and lots of things that he's done, not only obvious things like covering I'm So Proud, but also his work with Hall and Oates, and just his general approach to vocal arrangement. But anyway, going back to Nazz, Todd's from Upper Darby, outside of Philly, and he had played in a couple other bands. One was called Woody's Truck Stop, and so he and one of the other guys from that band went on to put together Nazz, which was, as he mentioned to me just a couple weeks ago, was initially designed as what we would now call power pop. The term didn't really exist in any kind of wide usage at that time, although Pete Townsend is more or less probably the one who coined the term, and that's as good a reference as any, because Nazz were very much an Anglophile band that modeled their approach and their style after The Who, the Small Faces, and high energy creative UK bands like that.
Matt, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean the Nazz, the thing that really drew me to them, and when I listen to them today, they have a very fresh sound. And the Nazz was a band that was kind of off on an island doing their thing, and they went about doing it very oddly, which is why why they didn't take off. But they've got some very unique production qualities to their songs that make their songs stand out among some of their contemporaries in the 60s. So I think that's one of the more interesting things about their music.
Yeah, that's one of the things that came to me, is sort of the freshness of it. You can have a great band, but there are certain bands that you associate with the 70s, or you associate with stoner rock, or what I found in listening to them, their whole playlist was like, Jesus Christ, they were as diverse as hell. I mean, you'd have, a seeming throwaway kind of Yellow Submarine silly song like Meridian Leeward, but if you look at the lyrics, and I printed up some of the lyrics, I'll go through a few of them, maybe a couple of songs later on them. But that's a song that has the words pig and cop in it. The speaker of the song is singing that he'd like to be a cop. He might be beating on you. I mean, this is a very politically potent song, but yet, anyone listening to that is probably just going to be caught up by the silly kind of almost hee-haw, the old show hee-haw kind of back and forth country-like feel to it. And you go from something like Magic Me, which is a real killer of a song. You have a song by Carson Van Osten, the Christopher Columbus song, which seems to presage something like Iron Maiden might have done in the 1980s, and with their historical references about stuff. It's just really fascinating. So let's talk about, we mentioned Todd Rundgren, and he's obviously the most famous member of this band. Let's talk about the three other members. Carson Van Osten, from what I can see, was with, in the band you mentioned, Bill, was with Rundgren. And so they left that band, and were they actively looking for other members, Bill?
as far as I know, yeah, that's how it came together. Is Todd and Carson wanted to put a band together, and they found the other two guys, and uh, they got management, and then shortly after that, they came into contact with John Kurland, who was a booking agent, and so he started securing some live dates for them, not many, which is something we'll get to, I'm sure. And eventually, he took over management of the band, and I, I think to some degree, Kurland uh, fancied himself as something of a Svengali, sort of along the lines of a Brian Epstein kind of thing, where he had a vision for how to market a band, and he was looking for a band that kind of fit the bill. And so that's how they connected, and that's how they got started, for better or worse.
How about the other two members? Matt, can you speak a little bit about Stuckey and Tony, the lead singer, and also Tom Mooney, the drummer? How did they get involved?
Well, I know that Mooney and Rundgren met. I think Mooney was actually playing drums in a basement somewhere. Rundgren overheard it and went and followed the sound, and that's how those guys met. So I think once, and Stuckey, I think, was the third guy or the last guy added, and they just pulled him from another band, I think, called Elizabeth.
Uh-huh.
And so it came together rather quickly. And I think everybody wanted to be in a band. And if you were a musician, I mean, you just grabbed the people that were closest to you and started playing. And I think that's how it happened with the Nazz. I mean, these guys weren't real close friends to begin with. They just wanted to form a band, and they formed one.
It's worth pointing out they were all teenagers at the time. These were not, you know, music industry veterans that had been, they were not a super group. They didn't come from other well-known bands. They were just four young guys who came together in Philly.
I think, Matt, you had done one of your band histories on another. Oh, it was the Small Faces, that they were under 21 in England. And they couldn't legally sign any record deal. Was that different in the U.S.? Was the U.S. more lax in letting 18 or 19-year-olds sign, contracts then?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if 18 was the cutoff point or 21.
Uh-huh.
I don't know that answer, but no matter how you cut it, show me a band that signed a good deal with good management or bad management. They all signed bad deals, and it doesn't matter what age they were, and it's always been an issue, and that's just the nature of the business.
Yeah, I forget whether it was in one of Bill's articles or in one of your videos, Matt. There's the story about they finally did dump their first bad management, and I think the band was stuck in St. Louis or something in a hotel, and then the second people who ended up managing them, they brought them down to Texas, and does that stir any?
That might have been a Bill story. I don't know that one.
No?
Wasn't mine. No,
Okay, so I read that somewhere online. Oh, it might have been. I was looking on Tom Mooney's Facebook. He might have mentioned that. But so let's talk about the four main members and their strengths and weaknesses with the band, because Rundgren has had obviously the longest and most successful career. But I have to say, having grown up knowing Todd Rundgren as a solo artist, and then with Utopia, and Utopia was Todd Rundgren's Utopia, often billed, they seem more to be just a backing band. What struck me when I heard the Nazz is this seems like a band. It's not just Todd Rundgren and three other guys, because and I'm not an expert, so I'll defer to you in terms of playing ability. But Mooney seems to be a hell of a good drummer. I mean, he goes off in diverse directions in songs. Stuckey and Tony, when you listen to some of the original songs that didn't make it to albums that had Todd Rundgren's voice on it, a lot of the songs that are really great songs are made great because of Antoni's more powerful, rich rock voice. And the only member that doesn't particularly stand out to me is Austin, but he seemed to have been a capable musician. So let's start with you, Matt, this time. What is your take on the four members of the Nazz, their strengths and weaknesses?
Well, I'll start with Tom Mooney. I think he's a real strength of the band. People liken him to Keith Moon. I think he's a little more. I've said in the past that he kind of pushes the tempo a bit, which gives their songs more excitement. And
Yeah.
that's not a rip on his timing. That's just that's a compliment on his feel. And I thought that he really led the band if I were to pick one of the instrumentalists. The other one who I think is really outstanding is the bass player, Carson Van Osten. I think he lays down some bottom. He reminds me of Ronnie Lane of the Small Faces. And a lot of bass playing when McCartney came on the scene and started doing all this flowery stuff, overdubbing on the backing tracks, they got away from that rock sound. And it's the bass player's job to lay down some of the bottom. And Van Osten certainly did that. I would say Rundgren, I think all his guitar playing is pretty solid across all the Nazz records. And although he wasn't, it didn't stand out as much to me, but I would say his production is what makes the Nazz sound so professional. And as far as Stookie, I think his voice is good on some of the songs, but some of the Rundgren songs, his voice doesn't seem appropriate. The reason they brought him in, I mean, Rundgren couldn't do the harder rock songs. I mean, very few people can have a higher, thinner voice like that and get away with it. I mean, Geddy Lee comes to mind as being maybe the only one. And Tony was brought in because he did have the stronger voice. And it works well on some ballads. I don't think it works as well on Hello, It's Me, for example. There's a couple songs where I think he sounds great. But it's just one of those things where the songwriter, his songs don't always, the vocalist can't interpret them as well as the songwriter could because they're more personal to him. I think that's the main thing.
Well, for me, Stookie's vocals stand out on things like Magic Me, the harder, raspier stuff. It stands out on like Under the Ice, these kinds of songs. What is your take on, Bill, on the four members, their strengths and weaknesses?
I think of Nazz as, with the exception of a couple of the sort of epic length tracks that they did, they were a song-based band. And so instrumental virtuosity and flashiness wasn't necessarily called for in the context of the kind of material that they were doing. I think that the three lesser known members were all, better than competent. They were perfectly suitable musicians for the material that they were doing. I would take issue with the idea that Todd's subsequent projects in band context were him and some other guys. The original 7-man Utopia was all hotshot musicians, and the 4-man, more mainstream pop / new wave Utopia were also superb musicians, all of whom had significant careers before they were playing with Todd, and notably, especially in this context, they're all still doing things. So, in and outside of, it's not, I mean, working with Todd certainly raised their profile, but they're all very, very busy guys in all kinds of other contexts, still working. So, yeah, I would just take a little bit of issue with the idea that, the people that Todd played with in subsequent years have been sort of afterthoughts. They were carefully chosen for their abilities. Nazz was not a case where he picked people to work with. It was more of a band, that's true. But let's face it, Todd wrote somewhere between 90 and 95% of the material.
And do you have any opinion on the other players, their strengths and weaknesses as a bassist, drummer, singer?
They're fine. They're good. To me, there's not a lot that really stands out about their instrumental work, but that's not meant as any sort of a dig. I think it suits the songs.
So we talked a little bit about bad management, so I just want to sort of give an overview of the band here. I know they went through several management or several managers, and Osten was the first one to then leave the band, and he apparently had a long and apparently storied career at the Disney company. I don't know whether it was as an animator or someone who was in charge of animation or whatnot. Do we know why he left the band? Was he feeling left out? Because oftentimes you see bands, I'm going in this direction, the other guy's going this direction. Matt, what reason did Osten have for leaving the band?
I don't really know the reason. I know that there's one very cool video where the band is playing on that, is it Where the Action Is? It's the Paul Revere and the Raiders show. And Carson Van Osten is not there, so they had to stand fill in for him. So that tells me that was in later '69. You know, maybe things were starting to crumble, and for whatever reason, I don't know why he was the first to leave. But I think it's important to understand that we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but they weren't really playing out as much as a live band after having just recorded an excellent album.
Yeah.
Maybe that band feeling was not there because in the studio, as you know, as you get more into the production techniques, particularly in the '60s, it takes time and you've got engineers doing a lot, and maybe it just feels less like a band effort as opposed to playing live. So I'm guessing on that, but we do know that after that second album, things kind of fell apart.
You know, Bill, I know I think you wrote a bit about this too, is when people have written about the Nazz, what little there is now 50 some years on, it's usually Todd Rundgren and the Nazz. And I'm just wondering, with the other members, yes, Todd wrote 95% of the songs, but just in terms of egos, it's hard to believe that someone like Stookie would just be saying, I'm going to hit this note because Todd says it, or that Mooney is going to do drumming exactly as Todd wants it. They had to be contributors in their own right. Is that correct? And was that part of the tension in the band, Bill?
Well, I'm sure they all contributed. I mean, there's no reason to think otherwise. Todd's beyond writing the songs, the fact that he became the de facto producer of the band certainly had a lot to do with the direction that they went. As he mentioned to me, you know, there were good things and there were not so good things about that. The good things is that it got done and got done well. The bad thing is that well, the bad thing in terms of the band's longevity was that having one of the bandmates suddenly elevated to the position of sort of calling some of the shots in the studio about how things were going to sound and what people would do, maybe not the specific notes they were playing, but things having to do with arrangement and sound textures. When that fell to one person, you know, feelings can start to get hurt a little bit. And as he said, they didn't really like taking orders from him.
Hmm. So let's talk about the first album, how that came about, and some of the good songs on there, and some of the things that might have been better. It was simply called Nazz, and we should say that the title of the band and the album comes from "The Nazz Are Blue," a song by the Yardbirds. And I read also that Alice Cooper's band, or Alice Cooper the band, was originally called Nazz. And was there any legal battle between those two bands, Matt or Bill?
I don't think so. I think neither band made big enough of a splash to have. I don't even think they knew of each other, to be honest. But I don't know. Things kind of started and ended so quickly that it wasn't an issue, so far as I know.
They were both pretty regional bands, and the Detroit Nazz didn't last very long. And by the way, even though on the song "Loosen Up," Todd refers to the band as the Nazz. He and all of them have made the point several times that it's just Nazz, no article, no the.
So the Rundgren band was just Nazz, and the Nazz became Alice Cooper. Then, is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I don't know if Alice Cooper's band used the word the either.
Oh, okay.
I don't know on that
Yeah,
one.
it was one of
I
those
just
things.
know that
where
Todd's band didn't.
Yeah, Tom Mooney has talked about, you know, not using the article and just calling them Nazz. And Rundgren refers to them as the Nazz in interviews. So I mean, I doesn't matter to me. I don't think there is a definite,
Oh,
you know, I guess they're lucky to be being talked about at all, you know, no matter what you call.
true.
So the first single from the first album was "Open My Eyes," which was the song I heard, and that's probably accounts for 95% of people's knowledge of the Nazz here decades later. Was that chosen by management? Was it chosen by the band? Because it's really a terrific song, and it has the first 10 or 12 bars are borrowed from the Who song. Which one is it? What's the Who song that's from? Just we don't know.
I forget it, actually. I hadn't picked up on that.
Yeah, I can't explain. Bump,
Oh,
but
yeah.
bump, but Either one of you want to talk about that first song that was
Well,
released?
as Todd said to me just a couple weeks ago, yes, they did want, they loved Open My Eyes, and they wanted that to be the first single. What happened, because this, we're talking about a day when there were regional radio station markets, and where disc jockeys actually made the decision of what songs to play, or program directors. It wasn't all focus groups and everything like that. In Boston, for example, when they got the record, they flipped it over and played the B-side, and that became the popular song. So Open My Eyes never really caught fire, even though it's a fantastic song. If not the best thing Nazz ever did, then definitely up there. But the radio stations tended to flip it over and play the ballad on B-side, which was, of course, Hello, It's Me.
Yeah. Matt, any comments about the first single?
Yeah, Open My Eyes did chart at a lowly 112, so that's the Bubbling Under chart.
Yeah.
And then when DJs did decide to flip it over, that was a very slow burn. That single entered the charts 2 different times, I believe, and it went well into late '69. So it just was one of those singles that caught on slowly, and some markets it charted higher, but I think it charted 2 different times. In America, it got to number 66 at the highest point, in Canada, number 39. So that was not the plug side. So that made the charts just based on requests and just word of mouth.
Yep.
Now this song was released with, I guess you call it, an early music video, dozen years before MTV hit, and it's a very Monkees-like video. The guys are wandering around like zombies, you know, from Night of the Living Dead or something. They see some beautiful girls, and you know, they're obviously not playing the actual song. They're just sort of fucking around and whatnot. What was that? Just a promotional video by the studio? Because where would something like that have played? Even I'm just asking because, like, as I said, this is a dozen years before MTV and music videos became a thing.
Well, I don't really know where they typically, like, the Beatles had already started doing promotional videos, so they wouldn't have to appear in America. So I think the band started the combination of pop music and film came on pretty quickly after the Beatles did Hard Day's Night. So bands were starting to do their own little videos, and I'm not sure. I assume that John Curlin probably had something to do with fronting the money for that video, because it's very well done. It's in color, and so perhaps that was going to be played or shipped to some, you know, shows to play where the Nazz couldn't appear. But I don't know where it would have played other than that.
Bill, do you have any idea?
There wasn't any kind of wide distribution for what we now call music videos in that day. There was a device called the Scopatone, which used to be in gentlemen's clubs. The Scopatone was a video jukebox, basically. You put in 4 quarters, and you got to watch a music video. And Procol Harum did some. I don't believe that the Nazz tune was done as a Scopatone, but it might have ended up there. So that's one possibility.
It seemed to have been a more British thing. I know the Hollies did a few of them, like Jennifer Eccles.
Yeah.
Matt, what other songs stand out for you? Because you mentioned "Hello, It's Me" earlier, and you said you preferred the Todd solo version a few years later. When I heard that, having refound it, I was kind of, at first I was sort of put off by the slowness and the sort of dreamy etheria from that song. But I actually, after listening to it a number of times and sort of comparing it with the solo Todd version, I actually prefer the Nazz version. It sounds more mournful, more rueful, whereas Todd's version sounds more like a typical pop song. Not that it's a bad song, but that plus his sort of warble on his voice, I prefer that version. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. The Nazz version does sound much more mournful. It's slower. It's a very nice arrangement, actually. And the Rundgren solo version is a '70s pop song, which is seems like a completely almost a different song.
Yeah.
And I like how I like Rundgren's delivery on his vocal in that song. The Something Anything album, I know that it's kind of interesting how he was still hung up on some girl from like high school or something. That whole album was kind of about that.
A little stalkery.
And so again, like the delivery, I think that Rundgren gives is I think it's one of his more special vocals.
Well, this version by the Nazz, though, seems to presage the later beautiful song on Nazz, which we'll talk about in a bit. But Bill, do you have any comment on the Nazz version of Hello, It's Me?
Yeah, I'll be the outlier here. I think it's kind of weak. I can see why it wasn't a bigger hit, and I can see why they certainly wouldn't have picked it to be the plug side, because as solid a song as it is, to me the arrangement is I don't know, it's unspectacular. I think whereas the Todd's solo version, you can see why I mean the man had no shortage of songs. The fact that he decided to re-record it tells me that he felt like this was too good to have sunk with more or less without a trace, and to have been memorialized in the original Nazz version. So he wanted to recut it and realize the arrangement and the production more along the lines of what he had in mind when he wrote it. So I give quite the edge to his re-recorded solo version as one of the great pop songs of the era.
With the rest of the album, the first album, just Nazz, the song that sticks out most to me as a layman is Back of Your Mind. And looking at the lyrics, it almost looks like something Jim Morrison might have read. Maybe he'd have a Fuck My Mother in there, but other than that, it's a very dark song. Speaking of like the Todd's obsession with some girl, it has a very I guess feminists would probably not like this song because it's sung by a man. But what songs stick out to you guys from the first album, other than the two we've mentioned so far?
Well, for me, there is certainly a hard edge to this album. And when Rundgren left Woody's Truck Stop, that band was going to go more psychedelic, and Rundgren didn't want to do that. So this album is not a psychedelic album per se. Like, everybody followed a certain kind of path. But the fact of the matter is that the production techniques and any kind of technological advancement oftentimes was seemingly more psychedelic. So you get some of those flourishes on this album, but generally I find it some really good pop songs and very good rock songs. And the song that I like as a good pop song is When I Get My Plane. Mm-hmm. And Bill had mentioned the term power pop. I'm not sure when that term came into being, or if Townsend coined that. I don't know when that was. I was not familiar with that term until, oh boy, late 80s maybe. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure when it came, but I mean, most bands don't like that label put on them. But I mean, essentially they were a band that was creating music for AM radio and for FM radio. And I think this album shows that.
I think Townsend used the phrase, I could be wrong, but I think he first used the phrase, the label, in an interview in 1965. And I would agree with you, When I Get My Plane is an exemplar of that, whether the label was being used or not, of that kind of power pop vibe. You mentioned the production on Nazz, on the first album, which is solid, although it's worth pointing out, and this is something that Todd and I went fairly deep on when we spoke recently, was that the idea of what a producer, quote unquote, was supposed to be differed between American industry and British industry. And the producer of the first album, Bill Trout, as Todd says, they were surprised when they discovered that Trout basically sat in the control room reading the trade magazines. He took no real involvement in how the record was going to sound. That fell to the band and the engineer that they used, who was a British guy who had been in a Liverpool band called the Undertakers. And Todd learned a lot from the experience of seeing that this was a hands-off producer who just didn't engage, and some of the watching the engineer closely and picking up, as he said, he didn't mind if I sort of skulked around behind him and paid attention, looked over his shoulder to see what he was doing. And so Todd was taking notes, as it were.
In the field of or using the term bad management, I think both of you have commented in your work about the band was not necessarily allowed to be a touring band. They wanted them to be more in the studio, and this had some repercussions. Am I correct in that, Matt or Bill?
No,
Oh,
yeah,
either
Bill,
one.
I'm going to hand this one over to Bill because I don't know if that was a decision that was specifically made or managed. My feeling is that their management that they had was more pop magazine oriented and was not a big. Their strength wasn't on the live circuit, but I'm not sure how that came to be. Bill, do you know?
Yeah, that was John Curlin's doing. His idea was, again, quoting not verbatim because I don't have the transcript in front of me, but Todd said that essentially John Curlin didn't want them to play a lot of gigs. He felt that, especially in the early days, his thinking was that don't play any gigs now, and once there's an album out, I'll be able to book you and get more money. The problem with that strategy is that once they did have an album out, he still didn't book them many gigs. And the teen magazine thing was central to Curlin's approach to marketing the band. He was good friends with Gloria Stavers, editor at 16, and so he got a number of photo spreads on Nazz, and they were appearing in Teen Beat, Tiger Beat, 16, all those sort of magazines before they ever had a record out. And so the idea was to try to build a buzz. The band were very sensitive to that. Already they're on a label called SGC, which of course is Screen Gems Columbia. That label was a bit of a fiction. It was created more or less specifically for Nazz. What the sister label to that would have been Cold Gems, which of course is Columbia Screen Gems, the most well-known band on that label, of course, being the Monkees. And the marketing that was done for Nazz was based a lot on the kind of things that were done to make the Monkees successful, and that really, really rankled the guys in Nazz. They really, really did not want to be marketed that way. That said, they were teenagers, they were signed to a record label, and they played along to some degree. And my guess is that the music video probably ties in with all that. But yeah, they didn't play a lot of gigs.
So their second album is Nazz, Nazz, and from what I've read, all over the internet, it was a clusterfuck from the start. They wanted to do, or Todd wanted a double album. He wanted his songs. The band wanted more rocking songs. They go to England to record. They're denied recording in England because they weren't part of like a musicians union. They hadn't the paperwork, so they had to come back to the U.S. And so it just seemed like everything that possible could go wrong. And yet, again, I'm a layman, but this is a great album. Nazz, I mean, if just as a layman here, looking at the 11 songs here, to me, the weakest songs, which are still good songs, are Kitty Boy and Featherbedding Lover, which are sort of like second-rate Yardbirds. But if you're going to be second-rate, be a band like the Yardbirds to be second-rate. Forget All About It is a great rocker. Not Wrong Long. I don't know how that didn't become a hit. That's the one that you mentioned with the guy who replaced Austin. Rain Ride is my personal favorite song there. Other than the occasional Iron Maiden or a Cream reference to Tales of Brave Ulysses, here we have taking Greek myth and bringing it into the modern age. Gonna Cry Today is a great ballad, as is I think Letters Don't Count, and a beautiful song. Under the Ice is a great rock. I mentioned Meridian Leewood as a funny song. Hang On Paul, which I have read. I don't know. Was that directed towards Paul McCartney. That's another one of those kind of fun kind of songs that is kind of silly. And it's just a great mix. It's so diverse. Let me start with you, Bill. What is your overview of that album? How it progressed or got better, or if you don't think it got better from the first album?
Well, I think if you have a band that has a prolific songwriter like Todd and a diverse songwriter, and you approach a project with the idea of making a double album, and then for whatever the reasons, you pare it down to a single album, you're going to take the winningest tracks, if you will. And so the fact that it's really strong makes sense. I think if a band sets out to make a 10-song album, they record 10 songs, well, there they are. But if they record twice as many and then just pick the quote unquote best ones, you're going to end up with a really, really strong record. And that's, I think, what happened here.
Matt?
Yeah, it's extremely strong. I don't know whose idea it was to do a double album, but talk about hubris. I mean, this is a band who the first album didn't do anything. They weren't touring. And what a label's going to do a double album, they're not going to invest in that. So yeah, it's totally natural to pare it down. And if you know the songs that didn't make it, I don't think having a double album would have made this a better album. I think it would have made it a weaker album. And I think it is an improvement over the first album. I mean, from a songwriting standpoint, from a playing standpoint, and from a production standpoint. And for a band that, I mean, talk about their management. I mean, in 1968 and 69, when FM radio took off and everybody was looking for rock bands to play ballrooms and music festivals, the Nazz would have been perfect for that. And yet they didn't take that path. And I think this is where it kind of ended. And I think during the recording of this album, it seems that the band was really starting to break up. So had they decided to stay together, it probably would have been a bigger hit and they could have, promoted it. And I don't see how it couldn't have done at least as well as some of the other. You compare it to some of the other San Francisco bands, and I mean, it holds up really well.
What do you think are the strongest songs, Matt? The 2 or 3 strongest songs?
Well, you had mentioned "Gonna Cry Today." I think that's their best ballad easily, and I think Stookie gives one of his best vocal performances. He really does that song justice. Not Wrong Long to me would have been, that did chart actually. That was a single, and they were pushing that song, and they appeared on a television show for that as well, miming to it. It hit number 90 in Canada, I believe, but didn't chart in the States. But I think that's a great song. I mean, you had mentioned not Under the Ice.
Rain Rider? Rain Rider?
Yeah, some really great rock songs. I think Rundgren's playing is really strong on this record. Mm-hmm. And it's different. It's American sounding. It doesn't sound like a British guitar player. It's blues based, but it sounds very bright and modern.
Yeah, and
a lot of the players coming, for instance, Big Brother, those acid guitar, it sounded completely different than that, and it sounded fresh.
Yeah, and I think it was you who mentioned earlier about Mooney's drum playing. To me, the harder edge songs here, I mean, there's something about his drum playing, and I'm not an expert, so I can't tell you why Neil Peart is on a level with John Bonham. I can't differentiate that, but there's something about the complexity of the way he's just going away doing, I guess, what they call fills, in between little beats, just doing little things, especially in something like Under the Ice, that really just grabs your attention. Bill, what do you think are the 2 or 3 strongest songs and why?
I think Forget All About It, the opener, is a really, really strong song. It's interesting. Nazz didn't get covered a lot. There are not a lot of other bands that in subsequent years would cover their material, but there's a phenomenal cover of Forget All About It by a North Carolina band called Glad Hands. They did it in the 90s, and it's phenomenal. They actually knew what was special about the song, and their arrangement is really, really good. And also, Under the Ice is, for me, the most Who-like song in the band's catalog. And Hang On Paul has a lot going for it too. It's a really kinetic arrangement. We mentioned the production on this album is very, very solid. It's credited to the band, in practical terms, that was Todd Rundgren, and the technical side of things, the engineering was done by James Lowe, who is best known as a member of the Electric Prunes. And Todd would go on to work with James Lowe as his engineer on some of his solo work as well. But those two are really responsible for the sound of the album and the really, really sharp production values, and the fact that it holds up and doesn't sound dated today, because you could take these really good songs, these really good instrumental and vocal performances, and give it a dated production, and we'd listen now and think, oh, this sounds of its time. It's a pretty timeless album, and I think a lot of that is down to the production values.
I want to just
Yeah.
read a couple of lyrics from one of the songs, Hang On Paul, and then just ask a question here, because the second verse starts with, you drag into the studio and don't care why. You got a life as big as City Hall, that's no lie. The aging owner treats you to a couple of beers, feeding you cliches about the thing between your ears. You wonder if it's all he can say. You'll find a better way to say it someday. But Paul, you're too busy stripping gears. Now, Paul, your life is dripping away. Now, it seems to be a character within there, but I've heard also that this is a direct sort of nod to Paul McCartney. Is that just an internet rumor, or what? Do either of you know?
I've not heard that.
I haven't
No.
heard it either.
Okay, then it's just probably something that's going around the stuff. But yeah, the lyrics, the all the instrumentals. I mean, they were really clicking, and to me, it's a shame, because if this had made it, and if they had made it with this, they go on 7-8 years to maybe the mid-70s. There's so much in here that other bands picked up on. For example, there's a lot of clapping in the background, the harmonies. That reminds me of Tom Scholz and Boston, which came 7-8 years later after they broke up. They seem to in a lot of these songs, you can see people may not have covered them, but they had to have some influence, because there's so much richness here. You talk about power pop. You can hear a lot of the things from the famous Budokan live album from Cheap Trick coming here, and we'll talk a little bit about Cheap Trick in a moment. They seem, and I saw a couple of videos. Even the Bangles did a cover version of "Open My Eyes," which is pretty good. So, were they one of these bands that lay people like me forgot about? But were they known within the rock music industry as a band? Hey, this is a band that you can do stuff like that. Were they, there are bands like that. Were they like that, Matt?
I have never heard any band reference the Nazz.
No.
I've never heard anybody in the 60s talk about the Nazz. I don't know any 60s band that covered any of their songs.
Well, there goes my theory.
I can tell you that I sat next to a bar in the 1980s, and I was a teenager, and a guy knew about the Nazz, strangely enough. But other than that, they flew under the radar and were out of the business pretty quick. I think that, I mean, there's probably, my guess is that the early 70s, once Rundgren started having his hits, is that the legend of the band started to percolate, and it probably got a second look or listen at that time. But I've not heard anything from anybody in the 60s even referencing these guys.
How about you, Bill?
Well, as Todd mentioned, from the time he co-founded the band until he left was about 18 months. So it was a blip on the radar screen, and there were a lot of high-profile things happening musically at the time, and so they kind of flew under the radar. They didn't make a big commercial splash, and they really weren't around that much. They weren't on bills with other bands. When they got their second look was actually in 1972, which is worth pointing out. Before Todd really hit it big as a solo artist, his Something Anything album with his remake of Hello, It's Me, that was a hit in 73. But in 1972, Lenny Kaye put together a compilation called Nuggets, which was hugely influential. And he included Open My Eyes as a track on that. So for a lot of people, that was their first exposure to Nazz, was in 1972.
Yeah, good point. I
Go
thought
ahead.
about that. Yeah.
It's interesting because, as I said, I'm a layperson just grew up with a lot of this stuff. Born in '65, so I remember the early '70s and all that music. And I still remember watching, guys on Ed Sullivan's show. But I said in the email that they reminded me, career-wise, of the Zombies. But then I watched your piece on the Zombies, your shows, Matt, on the Zombies, and even though they have some superficial stuff, they were quite different. The Zombies seemed to be more cohesive. They lasted longer. They put song after song out, and it didn't chart. But by the same token, they both, I think, only had 2 or 3 studio albums. The second Zombies album, Odyssey and Oracle, or Odyssey and Oracle, however you want to pronounce it, is also a masterpiece. They both was groups that relied on harmonies, but Nazz was a bit harder edge. But it's interesting in comparing them. In some superficial ways, they seem similar bands, although the Nazz didn't have the hits that the Zombies had too. But they had Rod Argent was basically their Todd Rundgren. Colin Blunstone was their Stookie. And so it's interesting. What bands would you liken them to, Matt? And then I'll ask Bill, in terms of whether it's overall career arc or sound or whatever.
Well, like Bill said, I mean, their existence was roughly 18 months where they were a cohesive band. I mean, there's some overlap that went beyond that, of course, but bands formed, got a record deal, changed members, released a few albums, and broke up within 18 months. That was common in the 60s. And I guess I would liken them to, there aren't a lot of, I mean, people compare them to The Who a lot. I mean, they get more comparisons to British bands than any American bands. And I don't know, I don't like that comparison to The Who, because British and American, to me, it's very distinctly different sounds. Mm. But I think that's what makes them somewhat unique, is that there isn't a real good band to compare them to. Because if you look at the album covers, it looks kind of Beatley, the foreheads floating, a little bit monkey-ish. Yeah. So they looked like a teen band, but they sounded like a legit rock band.
Yeah. And that video that I mentioned obviously is portraying them in a very Monkees-like fashion. Bill, who is a good analog in your mind to them, if anyone?
Yeah, I think Matt's right. There isn't really another band. You could just say any band that had a really short time together. They were explicitly modeled after the Who and the Small Faces. They were unapologetically Anglophile in their approach to music, but in the same way that the Beatles don't sound like the girl groups and the Motown bands and the early 50s rockers that inspired them, Nazz doesn't sound like just like the British bands that inspired them, but that's from where their influences came.
Let's talk just about the third album that was released, which was basically the stuff that didn't make the double album. There are a few good songs here. Some People, Only One Winner strikes to me. Magic Me, I think, is a real kick-ass rocker. And then the Christopher Columbus song by Austin. To me, they're the standout tracks there. There's also some other stuff online where you hear the demo versions with Todd's vocals holding the place. Why didn't some of these songs make it? They were already kaput as a band, I guess, by then. So, Matt, what about these songs stands out to you?
Well, these clearly sound like cast-offs from the sessions from the second album, and some of the tracks are very good. Some are maybe not fully realized. The band members have talked about the reason they broke up is because Todd Rundgren was doing songs that essentially weren't Nazz-style songs, i.e. they were more personal songs and not the harder rock songs. And some of those wound up on this third album, and you can kind of see why that is. So I think there was Rundgren he was such a strong writer and had so much material, and maybe he was the one pushing for the double album. But as I always say, quantity does not equal quality. These songs, could use a little bit more, and they might have been able to work them into the Nazz format, but they do seem like cast-offs. there are a couple good songs. I like, well, I guess the song that sounds the most un-Nazz like is "You Are My Window." You know, that's pretty soft, shall we say. But yeah, some people I like, and Magic Me is a great rock song. Uh, Stookie does a great job on Take the Hand, and they're having fun with Loosen Up. And you know, it seemed like they didn't always take themselves too seriously, and that's a strong part. That's, I think, important for some bands in the '60s, particularly because some bands took themselves way too seriously and got very pretentious. I don't think that really happened with the Nazz, although some of the members might think that Rundgren's personal stuff was a bit pretentious.
How about you, Bill? What any songs stand out for you in this sort of Castaways collection?
Yeah, I think Only One Winner is a nice mid-tempo tune that works really well. Magic Me, although it's rather simplistic, is a pretty good sort of hard rocker. I think the cover of Paul Revere and the Raiders' Kicks
Yeah,
is really solid. It's
yeah.
very well done, and
It seems to have a bit more, again, as a layman, a kind of undertow that sucks you into the song more than the Raiders version.
well, it's a couple of years later, so that
Yeah.
would make sense. I mean, you know, in the mid to late '60s, um, styles and approaches changed every, you know, within a 6 month period. So, you know, we're talking about a couple of years after the Raiders, so it would make sense that it would be harder edged.
Um,
I would say that Loosen Up is garbage. It doesn't belong on the album. And in fact, if you listen to um, an acetate version of the song on the new Rarities collection that has just come out from Purple Pyramid, it's even worse. You know, it didn't belong on an album. I don't think. Um, I I like to think that even had they made the double album, they wouldn't have bothered with Loosen Up. It's just screwing around. It's like it's the kind of thing where the you know the tape recorder happened to be running, but it doesn't really have a place on. It doesn't belong on any record really. It's a waste of a few minutes.
um, I've often told younger people when they ask me about music that I was born into and then grew up with that the 1960s seemingly were dominated by the British invasion, Motown, and then everything else was sort of either Burt Bacharach or a few psychedelic bands. And yet the Nazz doesn't fit into any of those. They're sort of like it. As a kid, I was into astronomy, and they seem to have been like a planet that was kicked out of the solar system, and they're just wandering out there. No one knows that they're wandering between stars there. And as I said earlier, when I just found it on the playlist, I was just blown away by the overall quality that I found there. And I'm just wondering, do you think do you think they would have had a bigger impact if somehow they had stayed together? If Todd had stayed there, if Austin hadn't gone to Disney, do you, or was it just something that was just doomed to fail? Either one of you want to jump in?
I think they were of their time. I think it was destined to just be, um, you know, a signpost on you know early on in Todd's career. He had ambitions that were too big for a band that had the kind of focus that the Nazz originally had. I mean, that's you know the fact that uh, you know, to his thinking, you know, he was at the time he was at the height of what he calls his Laura Nero fascination
Yeah.
and infatuation, and that kind of Laura Nero influence shows, you know, shines brightly in a lot of the more ballad material. Um, he wasn't going to, he wasn't suited at that point to be in a quote unquote power pop band that was just doing one style of music. So I don't see how it could have worked
You,
beyond when it did.
Matt?
Yeah, I agree. I think that that second album, something I think Rundgren realized, wow, I don't think I want to go forward with these guys. This is not, if he was focusing on his songwriting, I think he realized that that's probably not, the Nazz isn't going to be the vehicle to get all his songs out. And after he left Nazz, he started doing, he wasn't in a band, he wasn't producing music, he was becoming an engineer, and he thought he'd have a career change. So I think it's really kind of interesting. It seems like, well, he didn't want to be in that band. I mean, because he didn't form another band. He wasn't doing music.
Mm.
So I don't really know how long they could have gone on. I mean, they really would have had to had an agreement and liked what they were doing and each other enough. And I think they had some success, some sales success along the way. That could have gone that way, at least for another album, perhaps. But the way they were set up from the management standpoint, they couldn't have too much success unless they had a big hit single that would propel the album, which they did not have. So yeah, I don't know. It's most people wish that these bands that we love in the 60s would have stayed together longer because we would have got more stuff. But I don't consider the Nazz a failure at all. I think it's quite a triumph because, and there are like 100 other bands that only had two or three albums too that didn't have hits that we're still talking about today, because there was only so many positions on the album chart, on the singles chart. There's only so many places you can play live. So the cream rises to the top. And they didn't pass a certain level until much later.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit about the Nazz Fuse Cheap Trick connection in a moment, but let me throw this out to both of you, and especially you, Bill, since you talked with Todd. I've always gotten the sense that Todd Rundgren was one of these guys who just had such diverse musical interests that he sort of had musical ADD, that he kept hopping around from place to place, you know. And one of the things that draws me to the Nazz is I really didn't realize how good a hard rocker he could be in doing this stuff. And so when I listen now, and having watched a number of different videos and listened to music from Utopia and his solo stuff, and his interests in who he produced, it's like, for me, you know, he was sort of grounded, but he just sort of wanted to float in whatever direction hit him at the time. Do you get that sense of him as a restless sort of musical enemy in him? Or?
He's definitely a restless artist who doesn't like to do the same thing twice. And if he does do it twice, he's certainly not going to do it twice in a row. He's not a dilettante like some artists where, you know, they will, you know, try on, metaphorically speaking, try on a suit of clothes, you know, that may or may not fit them. I mean, he has genuine interest in all of the directions that he has pursued. And he's returned to power pop, for example, especially when Utopia pared down to the four-man lineup after the second Utopia album. They were essentially a power pop / new wave band. But you know, that approach wasn't then and wouldn't ever be enough to contain his musical vision. And so that's why, you know, the early version of Utopia was progressive along the lines of Mahavishnu Orchestra. He's done plenty of really hard rock stuff. He's done a blues album. He's done an oft and unjustly maligned hip hop album called No World Order, which is actually really good. He's done EDM. He's done ambient. He's been all over the map. But there's always a strong undercurrent of solid songwriting there. And that's, I think, the thing that sets him apart from other people who flit from style to style.
So let's talk about Stookie and Mooney, because we know Austin left the music business. Todd was Todd. How did we get from the remnants of the Nazz, as we've been discussing, to like Cheap Trick? Who did Mooney and Stookie know Nielsen or Xander from that? Matt, do you know this story? How they morphed?
Well, in the dying days of Nazz, Rundgren had left the band, and they continued on adding some other members. I think Rick Nielsen was at it briefly. I don't know too much about how many they were playing out, and they did a couple music festivals. But that was as Nazz broke up and they tried to continue their music careers, they were rubbing shoulders with other musicians who were also starting out. And that's where these guys from Fuse and then ultimately Cheap Trick kind of made connections with Stookie and with Mooney.
So did
Mooney, the whole thing is pretty fuzzy and murky, and nobody's really clear on it. There was Fuse, which was Rick Nielsen was in, and then there was Sick Man of Europe. Xander wasn't a member until all that had blown over and
Okay.
it was Cheap Trick, because Xander's not even the original lead singer from Cheap Trick.
Was Mooney replaced directly by Bun E. Carlos then, the drummer for Cheap Trick?
Boy, I'm cloudy on that as well. The what became
think
Cheap
so.
Trick, I think it was kind of an in and out band. It's a band that was trying to get work, and I think there were several configurations going. So I don't really know the progression of the Cheap Trick players too well with regard to that. But there was overlap, and they knew each other, and they played together, and they just weren't hitting it. They were just basically a live band. I don't think they recorded much.
Well,
If he's recording, I don't know.
let me just ask both of you before we end this, and I ask for your final opinions about the band. Is there anything that we have missed that you'd like to people who are watching this to know about the band, whether it's the music, whether it's their management, whatever? Bill, is there anything that you'd like to add in?
Well, I would just say in light of Todd Rundgren's esteemed and fairly high profile career in the years that followed, and even though it is very, very diverse, that anybody who has found any interest and value in any of his solo work or his work with other bands would do well to go back and check out this Nazz stuff, because a lot of the seeds of what he would do later can be found in here. And that aside, the music stands up on its own, even removed from the context of his career arc. It's good music.
And I would add, it's not just Todd Rundgren. The other guys were not just dead weight. Matt, what about you?
Yeah, I agree. The other guys were not dead weight. The Nazz was definitely a band, and obviously the most high profile is Rundgren. He gets talked about the most, and the reason we're here today is probably because of Todd Rundgren. And unfortunately, there's a lot of great players in bands that don't make it, like Mooney, or I'm a big fan of Carson Van Osten, and it's very 99% of people don't make it, even if they're fine players. So Rundgren, if I were to say if somebody were to ask me what's Todd Rundgren's golden age, I would say it's a solo period from roughly the 70s all the way through the early 80s. And he's got quite a resume, an unbelievable resume, not just as a recording artist, but as a producer. It'll choke a horse what he did during that time span. And everybody's got their time, and then that time ends. And his time was longer than most. So I think when I listen to his solo career, I find him pretty overwhelming for me personally, because I'm always kind of separating the songwriter from the producer. And but like Bill said, there's a lot there to get into. And you could enter it at several different junctures, whether it's Utopia, whether it's hits from the 70s. And so he overshadows the other players so much. And it's not because he was so much of a better player. It's just that he had so much more success.
And we should say we're
He's the one
talking
that had the
material
recording
success.
deals. I mean, the others did not have any sort of high profile recording deals or release anything of major note after Nazz. So the reason we remember him is because he did stuff.
Yeah. And as I said, material success, because the band did have artistic success in their two albums, I think, and that should not go understated. And it's interesting. You talked about Matt. You mentioned the early '80s as sort of the limit of the golden age. I've always found that pop stars, especially or pop artists, rather than say high artists, if you want, pop artists tend to peak in their mid-30s, and then it's sort of all downhill. I mean, what have the Rolling Stones done in 40 years? Does anyone remember any of their songs past, what was it, 81? And of course, they're milking the cow like a dairy farm, but still, creatively, when were the Rolling Stones last relevant?
1971.
Okay, there you go. You gained a decade on me there. So let me just finally ask for those, and it might be just a little bit of a repeater, for anyone who hasn't ever heard of the Nazz, let me just ask you, Bill, why should they just seek it out, the music?
If they like melodic rock, and if they are interested in the nexus where pop and more ambitious type rock intersected in the mid to late '60s, then especially that first album is a good place to start for music that they probably, that would fit in with other things they would enjoy, but that they might not be familiar with yet.
Mm. And Matt, same question to you. And let me just add on. You talked a little bit. We talked a little bit about the freshness. Why should people listen to it? And would you say that the freshness of the sound is part of that reason? It's timeless in a sense.
I would say they have a unique sound that is still fresh today, which I can't say about a lot of '60s bands. And I mean, '60s music is my forte, and I've been studying it for over 45 years. One of the things I hear Todd Rundgren say or not say in his many interviews he's done over the last 15 years, because he's got such a diverse resume and has so much success over such a long period of time, I always get the feeling he views the Nazz as just a very early time in his life that was so short that he doesn't talk about it a whole lot. He doesn't give it a lot of weight. But from my perspective, being a '60s fan, and the people that watch my channel are '60s music fans, I would like to say that the Nazz's music deserves a lot of attention because it is fresh, because it's great rock music, and I think that it holds up extremely well to the contemporaries of that time. And it's got the connection of Todd Rundgren. So everybody likes those connections. So I think it really holds up well, and time has treated it well.
Yeah, and I said earlier that I had just listened to your Association trilogy, the history of that band. There's an example of a good band that's so '60s. They're sort of, to me, they're sort of frozen in amber, or they are a '60s band. Whereas Nazz's stuff I could listen to today and feel that it was new. But I want to thank both of you, Matt Williamson. I'll link to Pop Goes the '60s YouTube channel. Bill Kopp, I'll link to Musascribe, your online magazine, and thank you very much for talking about this unfortunately forgotten but hopefully still relevant band.
Well, thank you, Dan.
Pleasure.